So, paper one. So I'll do another video. And we'll go through a few parts of the exam. Cameron Redpath, Maxim Sotter, they've made another request, so why not? And more coffee. So this is the 2015 paper, which we've given the standard students this week. They also have the marking criteria. But in essence, when we get an exam like this and we need to start pulling it apart, we say, how do we actually answer section one and how do we maximise section one's marks? It really is a section that you should be thinking about. I need to give myself every opportunity to get above 13 out of 15 in this section. The texts are right in front of me. And so it should be something that becomes a second nature to you by the time you get to that exam. It really is the one to practice. The other parts of the exam, particularly the essays in Module 2, it's about knowing the module, it's about the rubrics, it's about knowing the text, but this one is exam. And so really, you're asked to do a couple of things here. Demonstrate understanding of the way perceptions of discovery are shaped in and through texts. The key here is shaped in and through. That is, of course, techniques, language techniques, visual techniques, how language works. Every question, that is what they're asking you to do. Describe, explain, and analyse the relationship between language, text, and context. How does language work? In terms of discovery. The context is discovery. That's your context. It's exam paper. So this one we gave you opens with a short story, which is usually not what happens. I mean, you had that visual part, which is often first, but here they've done it in the first one. And I think in 2016 there wasn't a visual one. So working out whether or not you can question which one is actually going to be how the paper is going to look in paper one is it's as useful as what's the saying, chewing bubblegum to learn maths. It's a waste of your time. Just know how to do each question and do it well. In a short story, this question that we're asked when we go down here was asking us, in what ways is dialogue used to capture the young couple's reaction to the items they find? Now, if you look at that question, you break that question down, it's only worth 2, but you've got to get that first question nailed so you're confident. I mean, that's important. You don't want to spend too much time on it, which is also the other issue. So you say quickly, very quickly, what am I asked to do? Dialogue, I'm looking for dialogue, I can do that. I'll go back to the story, I'll look for dialogue. Young couple. That talks to what they're after, because if it's a young couple's reaction to 2 items they find, if it's a young couple, they're going to be excited by discoveries or fearful of discoveries. If it's an old couple, discovery is going to be reminiscence. So that's what we need to look for. So we go back here. So, okay, we're after dialogue. So the first bit of dialogue starts here. Oh man, look at this! Exclamation mark. Or as Chris Lowe calls it, something different than that, but so be it. Firstly, of course, you can talk to a couple of things. You can talk to the italicization of the word there. You can talk to the exclamation mark there. And you could say, oh man, look at this. Oh, the word man and the word this is in italics. And yeah, great. Okay, you might get a mark for that. You might not. The reason why you might not is because you've simply stated an obvious point. You're not actually investigating the relationship or the perception. And that's the important thing. Am I investigating the relationship and the perception? So if I was to mention this as italicized, I need to mention the fact that obviously the young couple have 2 things going on here. Firstly, they talk in a colloquialism. There, oh man, look at this. So their language is that of a younger generation. And secondly, the emphasis here, which is what italics do, and the double emphasis here, which is the exclamation, show us that the discovery for them is exciting, is new, is different, is fascinating in terms of going through this old wardrobe that they're doing. They're looking into the past, which is interesting. And we go through here, and the woman's reaction, the reaction is pretty truncated, pretty straightforward, isn't it? Like, don't do that. Don't discover anything. Don't go look at anything new. Don't be excited by this. So there is a dialogue also that shows us there's a conflict. And we move on. Books here, but then we get she cried out, and you might emphasise the word cried, an emotional reaction. But this one's good. Well, look at this. She whooped as she displayed a voluminous pair of white rayon bloomers against her chest. This whoa is onomatopoeic. There's another exclamation mark there. It's also, again, talking about a kind of slang. It's youth language, and then it's the language of excitement toward discovery. And then it moves on, but then we learn that the dialogue shows us that eventually they don't want any old junk in their old apartment. They are actually quite disgusted with each other, and there's a couple of other reactions to it. But in terms of answering for 2 marks, I just pick out 2 of those sentences like that and focus in on the language really, really quickly. All right, so now you've got 2 out of 15. Another 2 to get. How does this image represent an individual who values discovered objects? The word values I'd highlight. How means technique. So representation of an individual who values. And discovered objects, not discovery, discovered objects. So you're going to make sure that the question is clearly defined. 2 things I'd find, and I'd analyse those 2 things. So let's have a look here. This is a pretty good one. The discovered objects are in the front of the image, therefore they're given prior to purpose, they're given salience. There's a vector of his hand pointing down to the discovered objects. This man here is central to the picture itself. He's surrounded by discovered objects. And a beautiful thing, and this is, I would debt here to Maxim Sotter, which is an excellent thing that he used yesterday, and I have to get this out there. There's also an order to his discovered objects, and that order represents respect. That order represents a kind of way in which saying, I take everything here seriously. And that's a wonderful, wonderful insight. Okay. So that one's quite straightforward. You should get 2 out of 2 for that. You talk about the vector here, you talk about the prominence of the images there, you talk about the order of the bookcases there, and your home and host. But make sure you use that right language, salience, vector, framing, all that kind of stuff is very, very important. Very little you need to talk about in terms of colour in that one. You could talk about the curtains, would be another thing. There's a few other options as well. And then you get the one that often throws people, and that is a poem. Because a poem, we've done poetry with Wilfred Owen, but a poem suddenly takes a little bit of effort to work out what's going on here. And to work out how to read poetry, you need to work out how to read it rhythmically. You're in an exam, you can't read it out loud. That's a real issue. You do need to read it with rhythm. If you're sitting at your exam desk and you're doing this, you're actually going quite well. And you might note in the exam room there'll be a moment where your colleagues around you will start bopping their heads, and that's the moment they're reading the poems. If it's in module 2 paper, it's the moment they're actually trying to remember Wilfred Owen's poetry. But in this term, you're looking at what's going on here with this moment. So always look at the punctuation first in poetry. Always look at it. You'll note there's a little mini stop there, which is what a comma does. A full stop, of course, stops us completely. We know that, the Americans know that, because the Americans call a full stop a period. We just call a full stop. Dashes give you a change of inflection, so at the age of, my guess, 10. But then punctuation disappears here for a while, and it even disappears across the 2 stanzas, a thing we call enjambment and jamment. Through the forest on his way to school, along the sedgy wet-foot shore of the brimming Ilfage rug. It goes on. There's lots of items there listed with no commas. No commas. And that's quite important, because if you look at the age of the person who's describing, remembering the father at 10 years old, and so the father's, even though the father is now 100, the father's memory is 10 as a 10-year-old boy. And then you get this, look, see, there's another comma there, river, and then it brings it back into that sort of, so get into that reading of it first to get the meaning of it. Then look for, usually poetry has sequences or sections or moments. And this poem here sort of has two parts to it. The opening stanzas, which sort of run down the line here, and we get to scene there. And really, there's a big gap because the sentence ends here, and then you get the change of when the father saw the butterfly and his life changed forever. One day he saw a drenched log floating with the butterfly. So you note that, you say, okay, there's something going on here. The discovery of the butterfly was actually the discovery of something much, much bigger. And so we look at the question. Now, this question is worth 3, so we really have to focus in and concentrate and say, now I've got 4 out of 15. I need to make sure I get to 7 out of 15. I need to get it nearly to that 50% mark, and then I'm really doing well. Explain how the poem conveys the personal response of the father to his discoveries. Personal response, personal engagement to discovery, the father's discoveries, and how does the poem convey it through technique. First thing I would talk about would be the rhythm here. And this rhythm leads to a kind of hyperbolic language. 3 miles through the forest on his way to school, along edgy wetfoot shore of the brimming eel field, rushed from peat-bound river, leaving a trail of chittering black flies. It's exaggerated description. It might be realistic, but there's a lot going on there that, you just hear a story of someone about their own childhood, and it's not necessarily a complete truth. But there's this wonderful non-stop descriptive language here. All of these adjectives and nouns put together. Something you need to mention. That's the first thing. What that means in terms of process of discovery of the father, it gave the father an inquisitive mind. We move along. On the path, he noticed everything. Mushroom and scat, wild bloom, snail and rats. It must have been an endless breathing in between the wish to know and the need to praise. There was no scene. This moment here shows how the father's mind is being moulded by this natural world. So you would talk about that kind of, this second list here, mushroom and scat, wild bloom, but you'd also talk about this endless breathing in as a metaphor for endless movement of knowledge into the system, endless breathing in of knowledge. So the act of breathing in becomes metaphoric. And the third thing you might talk about is how there's a change in the poem. Here, when we see this butterfly, and this actually gave the character, the 10-year-old boy, the chance to really hone in on something very, very small and minute. So it's almost in direct contrast to this massive, endless world here that's in the first one. And you say, by contrast, the father's real discovery was the small and tiny and the detailed, which says here shot him off on his tangent. So the use of this word tangent, the use of the mathematical word, and shot him, the use of an effective word of movement, of quick fire. And so you might use that as a description or pull it out into the abstruse world of microscopes, numbers, lapels, pins, cars, and wanderings away from the 10 square miles of logged out bush lots. You might talk about the enjambment here, repeating from the enjambment there. So the list where things get bigger and bigger and bigger, the enjambment here goes into the idea of how things become more processed and more involved and more exacting. And so it's quite an interesting little poem in that sense. So it's the first 3 questions, which are worth those 3 marks. You've got then these 2 to go, non-fiction extract and here. And if you can get this one here, you've got to do exactly the same thing. Okay? The important thing about the 4th one, it's a non-fiction extract. How does the text analyse the difficulties of discovering what is true and what is false? And it's dealing with what we call the thing between history and memory. So I'm going to run out of time in this video, so I'll make a second section. We'll start deconstructing that and talk about how you do part E. See you soon.